Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
It was a humid August evening when I first met Sam. I was 21, fresh out of community college, and brimming with equal parts optimism and uncertainty. My dad had recently landed a new job in the neighboring town, a rare stroke of luck in northern Tennessee, where opportunities often felt as rare as snowfall in July. On his first day, he came home grinning like a kid, telling us how he'd reconnected with Sam, a childhood friend he hadn't seen in decades. Sam worked in the same department and had immediately hit it off with my dad again. A few weeks later, I accompanied my dad to a company picnic. It was one of those sticky summer days where the air seemed to buzz with cicadas and conversation. Sam was there, larger than life. He was in his mid-50s, tall but heavy-set, with a booming laugh that seemed to echo off the trees. From the moment we were introduced, he was overly kind, complimenting me in a way that felt just a little too personal. "You're beautiful, Andrea." "Truly stunning," he said, his eyes lingering a beat too long. I brushed it off, as I always did with compliments. Growing up, I'd been bullied for my weight, and had learned early on to laugh off remarks, whether kind or cruel. Over time, Sam's compliments became a constant feature whenever I visited my dad's office or attended company events. At first, they were innocuous, maybe even flattering, but as the months passed, they grew more pointed, more intimate. He'd tell me how much he admired women with curves, and how he found me uniquely beautiful. I started to feel uneasy but didn't want to make waves, especially since he was my dad's friend. When I turned 25, I landed a job at the same company, thanks to my dad's glowing recommendation. It wasn't my dream job, but the pay was good, and I'd be close to my family. What I didn't anticipate was being placed in Sam's department, where he'd be responsible for my training. At first, things were professional enough. Sam was patient and thorough, but the compliments resumed almost immediately. This time, they were more frequent, more intense. "You've got the kind of beauty that could stop traffic," he'd say, or if I were younger, "I'd never let you out of my sight." I laughed it off, trying to keep things light. But as weeks turned into months, his behavior grew harder to ignore. He'd find excuses to touch my arm or stand too close. His eyes would wander in ways that made my skin crawl. Once, when I bent down to grab a file, I caught him staring in a way that felt predatory. By then, I'd been dating someone for a few years, a relationship that, while loving, was strained by our conflicting work schedules. When we eventually broke up, Sam wasted no time inserting himself into my life as a self-appointed confidant. He'd listen to me vent about the breakup, offering words of support that felt genuine, at least at first. Then the comments shifted. "You deserve a man who sees how incredible you are," he'd say, his tone heavy with implication. Soon, he began asking inappropriate questions about my personal life, making offhand remarks about what it would be like to date someone his age. I felt trapped. Sam was my boss, and his friendliness masked the growing undercurrent of something more sinister. When he switched to the night shift to match mine, things escalated. He'd corner me in the break room, recounting lurid tales of his past relationships or asking invasive questions about my preferences. One night, he outright offered me money to spend the night with him. I was horrified but didn't know what to do. Reporting him felt like throwing a grenade into my work life, but his harassment was becoming unbearable. I started wearing oversized clothes, hoping to make myself less noticeable, but it didn't deter him. He began asking my co-workers for personal information about me, even offering money to one of my closest work friends to take photos of me without my knowledge. The breaking point came during the week before Christmas. I found out I'd be working a week of night shifts alone with Sam. The thought of it made my stomach churn. In a panic, I confided in my department manager, spilling everything I'd kept bottled up for months. To his credit, my manager acted swiftly. Sam's overtime was cancelled, and I was never left alone with him again. But the harassment didn't stop entirely. It lingered like a shadow over my days. making work feel like a minefield. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to HR, laying out every instance of his inappropriate behavior. An investigation followed, and within weeks Sam was fired. I also filed a police report resulting in a restraining order. Looking back, I wish I'd spoken up sooner, but the fear of retaliation and disbelief held me back. Sam's actions stole my sense of safety and made me question my worth. But speaking out eventually helped me reclaim my power. Now, years later, I'm in a better place, working a job I love and surrounded by people who respect me. Sam is just a distant, unpleasant memory. A reminder of how important it is to stand up for yourself, even when it feels impossible. Melissa's laughter echoed in my ears like a haunting melody as I stared at her in the flickering candlelight, struggling to process the nightmare unraveling around me. I had trusted her, clung to the hope that my best friend, the girl who had shared my childhood and countless secrets, was still in there somewhere. But the person standing before me, smiling as though this were all some game, was a stranger, cloaked in the skin of my oldest friend. My head throbbed from the blow, and I felt a trickle of something warm on my temple. Blood, maybe. My hands were bound tightly behind my back, the ropes biting into my wrists every time I moved. The floor beneath me was rough, cold, and coated in years of dust, making it hard to breathe without coughing. The air reeked of mildew and something metallic, something that churned my stomach. "Melissa," I rasped, my voice hoarse and trembling. "What are you doing? Please let me go." She ignored me, her eyes glassy and distant, as she thumbed through the notebook in her hands. The scribbles inside looked frantic, chaotic, like the ramblings of someone teetering on the edge of sanity. Symbols I couldn't recognize were scrawled across the pages, interspersed with jagged, looping handwriting. She began chanting again, her voice low and guttural, like it didn't even belong to her. The words were unintelligible, but their cadence sent shivers down my spine. "Melissa," I shouted this time, the sound echoing through the cavernous warehouse. My voice cracked, but it was enough to make her pause. She turned to me, tilting her head like a curious predator inspecting its prey. "You always thought you knew me," she said softly, her tone almost wistful. "But you never did. None of you did. What are you talking about?" My chest tightened with panic as she crouched down in front of me, the knife in her hand catching the candlelight. "Melissa, you're scaring me. This isn't you. We can get through this together. Just untie me, and we'll figure it out, okay?" Her laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through the silence like broken glass. "Figure it out? You still think this is about me, don't you? This isn't about me, it's about them. Them." My voice was barely a whisper. She stood abruptly, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "You'll see," she said cryptically, pacing around me in a slow, deliberate circle. "You'll see everything soon enough. They promised me you'd be the one to help me finish it." My blood ran cold. "Finish what?" She didn't answer, instead resuming her chant. The candles around me flared, their flames stretching unnaturally high, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I struggled against my bindings, but the ropes held fast. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the symbols drawn on the floor weren't random. They formed a circle, one I was trapped in the center of. "Melissa, stop this," I pleaded, tears stinging my eyes. "You don't have to do this. Whatever's going on, we can fix it. Just talk to me." Her chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the room seemed to hum with energy. The shadows in the corners darkened, deepened, as though they were alive and inching closer. The air grew colder, and my breath came out in visible puffs. And then it happened. A sound, low, guttural, and otherworldly, emanated from the darkness. It was a growl, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. It reverberated through the warehouse, shaking the very ground beneath me. Melissa froze, her eyes wide and glistening with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Anticipation? Both? "They're here," she whispered, a twisted smile creeping across her face. The shadows seemed to ripple, coalescing into something tangible. figure began to take shape. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, pinpricks of malevolence that seemed to pierce straight through me. I screamed, thrashing against the ropes with every ounce of strength I had. "Melissa, stop. Please make it stop." But she was transfixed, her arms outstretched as though welcoming the monstrosity into our world. The figure moved closer, its movements jerky and unsettling, like a film reel skipping frames. The air grew thicker, heavier, and I felt an unbearable pressure in my chest as though the very atmosphere were trying to crush me. "Melissa," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "This isn't you. Please come back." For a moment, just a flicker, something in her expression shifted. Her eyes softened, and her hands wavered. But then the figure reached out, its elongated fingers brushing against her shoulder, and whatever glimmer of humanity had resurfaced was snuffed out in an instant. She turned to me, her face contorted with a mix of ecstasy and despair. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own pounding heart. "This is the only way. They'll make everything better. For me, for you, for all of us." The figure extended its other hand toward me, and I felt an icy chill creep up my spine. My vision blurred as the world seemed to tilt, the edges of my consciousness fraying. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only watch in horror as the darkness closed in. And then, just as the figure's fingers were about to touch me, a sudden burst of light flooded the warehouse. The sound of a car engine roared outside, followed by shouting, voices I recognized. Melissa's sister and her father burst through the doors, flashlights in hand. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into the shadows as though it had never been there. Melissa screamed, a sound of pure, unbridled anguish, as her father tackled her to the ground, wrenching the knife from her grasp. I sobbed with relief as her sister untied me, her hands trembling as much as mine. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice thick with tears. I could only nod, my body shaking too violently to speak. Melissa thrashed against her father's grip, her screams echoing through the warehouse as he dragged her toward the exit. The candles flickered and died, plunging us into darkness once more. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that warehouse. Melissa was taken away that night, and though I visited her in the months that followed, she was never the same. The girl I had known, the girl I had loved like a sister, was gone. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I still hear her voice in my dreams, whispering those same unintelligible words, and I can't help but wonder if they are still out there waiting. The early years of my life were nothing to be proud of. I dropped out of high school and spent most of my 20s in and out of trouble, living recklessly and paying the price for my mistakes. By the time I turned 30, I knew something had to change. I had no direction, no real friends, and nothing to show for the years I'd burned through. I needed a fresh start, so I began attending local community events, hoping to find some meaning in my life. That's when I met Harris. Harris wasn't like anyone I'd ever met before. I first saw him at a neighborhood charity gathering where he stood out with his calm demeanor and warm smile. He had a way of making everyone feel welcome, like they belonged. Oddly enough, Harris didn't claim to follow any particular faith, but he was at every event, always helping out. When I asked him why, he simply said, "Because it's good to do good." His words stuck with me. Everyone adored Harris. He seemed like a man of boundless generosity and kindness, always giving his time, money, and effort to make the world a little better. He'd deliver food and clothes to those in need, volunteer at shelters, and offer a listening ear to anyone who seemed troubled. Before long, I found myself gravitating toward him. It wasn't just his charity work, it was his presence. He felt solid, like someone who truly cared. When Harris offered me a chance to help him with his community projects, I jumped at it. He didn't care about my past, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had a purpose. We worked side by side every day, distributing meals, organizing drives, and doing whatever we could to help others. Over time, he became more than just a mentor. He became a friend. Harris even let me move into the guest house behind his home when I couldn't afford a place of my own. It was a modest little cottage separated from his house by a small patch of grass, and it quickly became my sanctuary. Life felt stable for the first time in years. But then, one evening, everything changed. We'd spent the day handing out supplies at a local shelter. Harris seemed distracted, quiet and distant in a way I'd never seen before. He was usually full of energy, always joking or chatting, but that day he barely spoke. On the drive home, I asked him if something was wrong. He just smiled faintly and said, "I'm fine, just tired." I didn't press him, but the uneasy feeling in my gut lingered. Later that night, as I settled into the guest house, I glanced out the window toward Harris's home. His lights were still on, and through the partially open blinds, I could see him pacing back and forth in his living room. Something about his movement seemed frantic, almost desperate. I told myself it wasn't my business, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside and crossed the lawn quietly, hoping to get a better sense of what was going on. As I got closer, I heard raised voices. Harris was shouting, something I'd never heard him do before. His words were muffled, but his tone was sharp, angry, and filled with a frustration that sent chills down my spine. I crept closer to the window and peeked inside. Harris was on the phone, pacing like a caged animal. "You think I can just wait forever?" he barked. "Do it now, or I'll find someone else who will." He slammed the phone down, his chest heaving with rage. Then, as if sensing my presence, his head snapped toward the window. Our eyes met. Panic surged through me and I ducked away, my heart pounding. A moment later, I heard the front door swing open with a loud bang. "Sam!" Harris's voice boomed into the night. "Get over here!" I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. But before I could move, Harris stormed across the yard and grabbed me by the collar. His face was twisted with anger, nothing like the kind, gentle man I thought I knew. "What the hell were you doing?" he yelled, shaking me. "Spying on me," I stammered, trying to explain, but he wasn't listening. He shoved me against the wall and accused me of things I couldn't even comprehend. "You're after my money, aren't you?" he snarled. "You think you can take what's mine?" "No," I protested. "I don't even know what you're talking about." But Harris wasn't hearing it. He threw me to the ground, his fury boiling over. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw him storm back into his house. Through the window, I watched as he opened a heavy wooden chest and pulled out a handgun. That was enough for me. I grabbed a few belongings from the guest house and bolted into the woods behind the property. My heart raced as I weaved through the trees, Harris's voice echoing behind me. "Sam, you can't hide from me," he screamed. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a car and begged the driver to call the police. When the officers arrived, I told them everything. They went to Harris's house and took him into custody, but I never learned the full story. Whatever secrets Harris had been hiding, they remained buried. Even his real name turned out to be a mystery. To this day, I don't know what drove Harris to the edge that night, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes, the rage, the desperation, and the shadow of a man who had once been my friend. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air smelled of wet leaves and distant fires. I remember it well because it marked the beginning of something that would haunt me for years. I was 13 then, living in a small, quiet town that seemed plucked straight out of a postcard. My days were mostly predictable: school, home, and the occasional sleepover at a friend's place. That's how I met Ellie. Ellie wasn't like the other kids at school. She was reserved, always lost in her own world, and never seemed to care about fitting in. She sat alone during lunch, doodling intricate patterns in her notebook. At first I thought she was just shy, but when I finally mustered up the courage to talk to her, I realized she was funny, kind, and wickedly smart. We became inseparable almost overnight. Ellie's house was a creaky old Victorian tucked away at the edge of town. It had peeling paint, ivy climbing up the walls, and a front porch that groaned under your weight. Her mom, Miriam, was warm and welcoming, always offering cookies or tea. But Ellie's stepdad, Walter, was another story entirely. Walter was a wiry man with piercing eyes that always seemed to linger just a little too long. He spoke with a syrupy tone that made my skin crawl, and he had this unnerving habit of showing up wherever Ellie and I were. At first I brushed it off. Adults were weird sometimes, right? But there was something about him, something I couldn't quite put into words back then, that felt wrong. One Saturday, Ellie invited me over for a sleepover. We spent the evening making up stories and laughing until our sides hurt. As the night wore on, we ended up sprawled on her bedroom floor, sorting through her collection of old trinkets and dolls. That's when Walter barged in. He didn't knock, didn't say a word, just stood there, glaring at Ellie. Then out of nowhere, he grabbed her dolls, stuffed them into a trash bag and stormed out. Ellie ran after him, pleading and sobbing, but he wouldn't stop. I followed her downstairs, my heart pounding. Walter shouted something about respect and obedience, then pulled off his belt and raised it like a weapon. Ellie froze, her face pale with fear. She shoved me toward the door, whispering, "Just go." I didn't want to leave her, but the terror in her eyes told me I had to. As soon as I stepped outside, the door slammed shut, and her muffled screams echoed through the night. I stood there, paralyzed, until the noise stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to go back in, I found Ellie sitting on her bed, brushing the tangled hair of one of her dolls. She smiled weakly, but her red, swollen eyes gave her away. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat beside her, silent and helpless. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening for any sound that might mean Ellie was in danger. Around midnight, I decided to get some water. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the dimly lit hallway. As I passed the living room, I froze. Walter was there, sprawled out on the couch, half dressed and engrossed in something on his phone. But it wasn't just that. What he was doing, it was vile, disgusting, and horrifying. When he noticed me, he didn't stop. He just stared, his lips curling into a sickening smile. I was too shocked to move, rooted to the spot like a deer caught in headlights. Finally, my legs obeyed me, and I bolted back upstairs, slamming Ellie's door shut behind me. She stirred but didn't wake. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a corner, clutching a pillow, my mind racing. When morning came, I made up an excuse to leave early and swore I'd never set foot in that house again. I kept the incident to myself, too ashamed and confused to tell anyone. Looking back, I wish I had. Maybe I could have spared Ellie some of the pain that came later. Years passed, and I moved away. Life went on, but the memories of that house lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. It wasn't until a chance reunion with Ellie, years later, that I learned the full extent of what had happened. We met at a small cafe catching up over coffee. She told me how Walter's abuse escalated, how her mother finally reported him after he hurt her older sister. The authorities got involved, but Walter slipped through the cracks, free to torment others. Ellie said she had spent years in therapy, trying to rebuild herself piece by piece. I shared my own struggles, the nightmares and the guilt. We sat there for hours, two survivors of the same storm, finding solace in each other's company. Even now, Walter's ghost lingers. Not in the literal sense, but in the scars he left behind. He's a reminder of how darkness can hide in plain sight, and how important it is to speak up, no matter how scary it might be. If I could go back in time, I'd tell that younger version of myself to be braver, to fight harder. But all I can do now is tell the story, hoping it helps someone else find their voice. When I was 5, the world seemed like a place where everything was simple and safe. My best friend Ella was 6, and we did almost everything together. We attended the same small school, which was shaped like an old upside-down T. The shorter wing was mostly abandoned, with dusty windows and locked doors, while the main building was always bustling with students and teachers. Cars would stop on one side of the building, near the overgrown bushes that lined the back lot. One warm afternoon, Ella did something that really got under my skin. She grabbed my brand new markers without asking. Those markers were my prized possession, and I had been saving them for a special drawing. I was furious, but didn't confront her right away. Instead, I decided to get back at her. At recess, I saw her wandering toward the back of the building, a spot where kids weren't supposed to go. Seizing my chance, I followed her, keeping a safe distance, ready to spring my revenge. As Ella turned the corner, I froze. Parked near the bushes was a dusty, beat-up sedan, its engine humming softly. A man sat inside, leaning across the passenger seat. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his voice was cheerful, almost too cheerful. "Hey, little girl," he called out, holding up a small bag of candy. "Want some? Come closer, and I'll give you more." Ella stopped in her tracks, tilting her head curiously. I watched, confused. Something about the way he stayed in the car felt off. Why didn't he just get out and hand her the candy? I didn't understand much as a kid, but something about the scene made my stomach twist. Ella began walking toward him, stepping just outside the school's boundary. My heart raced, not out of fear but from an idea. A perfect, petty opportunity to mess with her. I cupped my hands around my mouth and yelled, "Ella, the teacher's looking for you. If you don't come back right now, I'm going to tell her you're breaking the rules." Ella stopped, hesitating. Her tiny hands clenched into fists as she turned back to glare at me. She looked so mad, and I couldn't help but laugh. I stuck my tongue out at her, certain I had won this round. "Teacher, teacher," I teased, pretending to call for help. What happened next wiped the smug grin off my face. The man in the car slammed the passenger door shut. His friendly expression vanished in an instant, replaced by something cold and unnerving. The car's engine roared louder as it jerked into reverse, tires crunching over gravel. Within seconds, the car sped off down the road, leaving a trail of dust behind. Ella stormed toward me, her cheeks red with anger. "You ruined it!" she shouted, jabbing a finger at me. "He was giving me candy and you scared him away. You're just jealous." "Jealous?" I shot back, still grinning. "Of what? Getting in trouble for leaving school?" "You're welcome, by the way." Ella didn't think it was funny. She chased me across the playground, threatening to punch me, while I kept laughing and dodging her. Our little game of tag ended when the teacher noticed us. She marched over, arms crossed, and scolded us for fighting. Ella wasted no time in tattling on me, her words spilling out in an angry rush. "She scared away the candy man," Ella said, pointing at me accusingly. "He was going to give me cookies and candy, but she ruined it." I expected the teacher to frown, or maybe laugh at how silly we were being. Instead, her face went pale. Her eyes darted toward the parking lot, then back to us. She didn't say a word, just grabbed our hands and hurried us inside. The whistle blew shortly after, signaling the end of recess. Once all the students were in the classroom, the teacher closed the door and stood in front of us, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Children, I need you to listen carefully. Never ever talk to strangers, especially if they offer you something. You must tell a teacher right away." The mood in the room shifted. Even Ella seemed unsettled, her earlier anger fading into silence. The next day, our parents were called in for a meeting. Rumors spread among the kids. Some said the man in the car had been seen near other schools too. After that, the school hired a security guard to patrol the lot during school hours, and the rules about staying within the playground boundaries were strictly enforced. Looking back as an adult, I feel a chill run down my spine. I didn't understand at the time how dangerous that moment was, or how close Ella came to stepping into that car. My childish prank intended to annoy her might have saved her from something far worse. Even now, the memory of that dusty sedan and the man's sudden cold expression haunts me. What would have happened if I hadn't followed her that day? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best.